Three branches, one nation, and a delicate dance of checks and balances, or so we were told. But what happens when the branch that is supposed to interpret the rules starts to write them and then rewrites them again? In fact, in some cases, just ignoring them altogether. Welcome to Chapter 3, the Supreme Corporation. Oh, sorry about that, the Supreme Court. Let's rewind to 1789. America's shiny new Constitution needed a shiny new referee. Enter the Judiciary Act of 1789, a political brainchild that was crafted to settle fights between big national powers and the proud states that didn't want to be bossed around. The man behind this legal marvel was Oliver Ellsworth, Connecticut senator, lawyer, devout Federalist, and perhaps the most underrated founding father you've never heard of. Ellsworth didn't just help to birth the Supreme Court, he also brokered the Great Compromise of 1787, which basically kept the Constitutional Convention from ending in a food fight. George Washington thought Ellsworth was the pinnacle of men. John Adams believed him to have strength of character. This is old-timey code for, this guy can be trusted not to mess it up too badly. The very first Supreme Court did not look like the juggernaut of today. Only 6 judges, John Jay, as Chief Justice. The country was so large and rugged that the justices spent half of their time in stagecoaches instead of writing landmark decisions. Back then, being a Supreme Court justice meant you didn't just seat in a fancy building in D.C., you hit the road twice a year. They would cover 3 enormous circuits consisting of Middle, Eastern, and Southern. Think road trip, but with 0 suspension, 19-hour days, and trails that would turn into mud pits every time it rained. Chief Justice Jay almost quit over the conditions. Can you blame him? Over time, the court grew, adding 2 new justices of Thomas Johnson and William Patterson. Fast forward 2 centuries and the Supreme Court is no longer a dusty appeals court for 13 district courts. It has become the final word on almost everything, from voting rights to corporate personhood. Some say that's what keeps democracy fair. Others argue that the bench has expanded into an unelected super-legislature. Or, more bluntly, the Supreme Court was bought by corporations and hold political allegiances depending on ideologies, not blind justice. What started as a compromise between state and federal power has become a courtroom where the fate of millions hangs on a single vote and where ideology can overshadow impartiality. Checks and balances? More like checks, balances, and loopholes. Ah, the J Court, the original crew of legal avengers. Or maybe more like a committee stuck arguing over what snacks to bring to the meeting. For all the grandeur of black robes and gavel banging, John Jay's Supreme Court only managed to hear 4 cases during his time. 4! That's fewer than most reality TV judges handle in an afternoon. You see, back then the Supreme Court's biggest case was figuring out how to Supreme Court. And their very first shot at legal glory? Van Staphorst v. Maryland, which fizzled out before anyone could even warm up their legal arguments. Next came Collett v. Collett, the first appellate case. But again, dropped like a hot potato. So the honor of being the first actual Supreme Court decision fell to West v. Barnes in 1791. Let's unpack this. William West, Revolutionary Militia General, part-time judge, full-time unlucky farmer, found himself stuck with a dud of a molasses farm. For 2 decades, he bled money into a mortgage owed to the posh Jenkins family. Desperate, West begged Rhode Island for permission to hold a lottery to pay off the debt. The state, ever grateful for a man who fought the British, agreed. But here comes David Barnes, the heir to the mortgage, who sniffed at West's paper money. Barnes demanded good old shiny gold and silver instead. West, like any stubborn American, decided to fight back, representing himself in circuit court. He lost. So he took it all the way to the Supreme Court, this time with a real lawyer, William Bradford Jr. But alas, no amount of courtroom flair could save him from the real villain, paperwork. The writ of error, his lifeline to appeal, was sealed by the wrong clerk. To fix it, West needed to gallop all the way to Philadelphia within 10 days, not exactly uber convenient in 1791. Unsurprisingly, he missed the deadline. The J Court ruled 5-0 against him. Farm gone. Dreams crushed. Bureaucracy wins. Now, if you blinked, you missed the next Chief Justice, John Rutledge, a man who holds not 1 but 2 records, Shortest time as Chief Justice, 138 days, and shortest time as an Associate Justice, just over a year. Quite the resume. President Washington gave Rutledge the top seat during a Senate recess, but during his downtime, Rutledge gave a fiery speech trashing the Jay Treaty, an agreement meant to smooth things over with Britain post-revolution. Rutledge and fellow South Carolinians thought it was too cozy with the British. Washington, loyal to a fault, still backed Rutledge, but the Senate was not feeling forgiving. They booted him when they reconvened. Ouch! Rutledge's court ruled on only 2 cases. One U.S. versus Peters, a squabble over who owns a captured ship. 2 Talbot v. Jansen, a debate about dual citizenship. Both maritime headaches, both forgotten by history class. Now, why does any of this ancient legal trivia matter? Because here's the twist. These early Supreme Court justices were supposed to safeguard the people, to wrap us in the warm blanket of due process that the Constitution promised. But as we'll see in later chapters, some of their descendants in black robes helped stitch up an even cozier blanket for corporations. Back then, corporations needed strict charters. Now, they've become juggernauts with the rights of people, but the wallets of empires, thanks, in part, to the robed guardians who sometimes forgot whose side they were supposed to be. So remember, when you see that grand marble building and hear equal justice under law, know that behind the pillars and Latin phrases lies a history of power and a few convenient loopholes. At the turn of the 20th century, as America barreled toward modernity, it was men like James Clark McReynolds who sat perched on the highest bench, cloaked not only in judicial robes, but in the prejudices and iron convictions of a bygone era. Appointed in 1914 by President Woodrow Wilson, McReynolds was initially hailed as a fierce guardian against corporate monopolies, a crusader wielding the Sherman Antitrust Act like a sword against the giants of unchecked capitalism. Yet behind the marble columns, the man himself was far less noble than the mission. To some, he was the embodiment of the disciplined Southern lawyer, a product of small-town tradition. But to many who served alongside him, McReynolds was something else entirely: selfish, vindictive, and consumed by biases that had no place in a courtroom claiming blind justice. He would become notorious as one of the so-called Four Horsemen, a quartet of conservative justices who zealously dismantled progressive reforms during the Great Depression, striking down efforts to curb corporate power and protect laborers. But while his judicial philosophy staunchly defended states' rights and business interests, his personal prejudices were even more unsettling. He shunned his Jewish colleagues, sometimes refusing even to sit near them. He would exit the chamber if a woman argued before the court. He refused to hire black clerks, or any who smoked, drank, or dared to be happily engaged. His law clerks tiptoed in fear of his unpredictable wrath, describing their service like clerking for Scrooge himself. Often, he simply didn't bother with the bench at all, preferring hunting or golf to the tedious work of the people's justice. And yet, paradoxically, this very man authored opinions that rippled far beyond his own backward beliefs. In Meyer v. Nebraska, McReynolds sided with a humble schoolteacher, Robert Meyer, defending the right to teach German to children at a time when anti-German sentiment was high. He struck down a Nebraska law banning foreign language education for young children, arguing that it violated the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. In a twist that history alone could craft, this bigoted Southern judge laid down language that would later fortify landmark rulings on personal liberty, from reproductive freedom to LGBTQ rights. It was a precedent for the idea that family life, education, and privacy are shielded from undue government intrusion. A legacy he likely never envisioned, and perhaps would have disdained, forged from a decision rooted in the simple defense of a teacher's right to teach. James Clark McReynolds left behind a trail of contradiction. By the dawn of the 1900s, American factories hummed with a hidden cost: the small hands and backs of child laborers. In 1916, Congress attempted to rewrite this grim reality. The Keating-Owen Act sought to draw a moral line through the factory gates. No child under 14 could work in mills, canneries, or shops who produced goods for interstate commerce. No child under 16 could work in a mine, and none could work more than 8 hours per day. But for Roland Dagenhart, a father and mill worker in North Carolina, that law struck closer to home than Congress could imagine. He argued that barring his sons from the mill floor would devastate his family's livelihood. Dagenhart claimed that the act overreached federal authority, trespassed on states' rights, and violated his right to use his family labor as he saw fit. In 1918, the Supreme Court weighed his claim. In a narrow 5-4 decision, the court sided not with the children, but with the mills. Justices Day, White, Van Devonter, Pitney, and James Clark McReynolds formed the fragile majority. The opinion, read by Justice Day, concluded that Congress had no power to regulate child labor under the Commerce Clause. Manufacturing, they said, was local. Only the transport of goods was interstate. The ruling left the door wide open for factories to keep their youngest laborers on the floor, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It wasn't until 1941, nearly a quarter century later, that United States v. Darby Lumber Company finally overturned Hammer v. Dagenhart, closing this legal loophole. Yet in 1918, the message was clear. In the eyes of the court's conservative bloc, the Four Horsemen and their allies, protecting commerce outweighed protecting childhood. One more brick in the wall of corporate freedom, laid on the backs of children. In the shadows of America's roaring prosperity, women and children often bore the brunt of poverty wages. In 1918, the District of Columbia sought to draw a line in the dust. It passed a law to guarantee a bare minimum wage for women and children laborers. A wage board set basic weekly pay: $16.50 for workers in the food industry, $15 for laundries, and so on. Enough, lawmakers hoped, to keep workers from slipping into destitution. But not everyone agreed that fairness should have a price tag. The Children's Hospital of the District of Columbia, a major employer of low-paid women, bristled at the new law. They argued it violated the sacred liberty of contract that the Supreme Court had once championed in Lochner v. New York. In 1923, the case rose to the High Court, Adkins v. Children's Hospital. This time, the Supreme Court sided with the hospital. By a 5-3 vote, the ruling echoed the old Lochner spirit, that government should not interfere with the freedom of employers and employees to freely contract, even if that freedom meant starvation wages. At the heart of the majority sat McReynolds, a man history remembers less for his legal mind than for his unyielding bigotry. Born in the Confederate sympathizing town of Elkton, Kentucky, McReynolds carried forward the narrow prejudices of his upbringing: racist, anti-Semitic, and viciously misogynistic. So detested was McReynolds that when he died in 1946, no fellow justice attended his funeral. Even President Taft, who once called him Abel, could not stomach his poisonous demeanor. Under Adkins, women's wages remained at the mercy of the market. Once again, the court's conservative wing, the so-called Guardians of Liberty, shielded corporate profits behind the iron wall of freedom of contract. The fight for a living wage, for women's equality, and for humane working conditions would not die here. But the road to justice remained long, winding, and full of betrayals. If you like this video, please click the like and subscribe buttons. Please keep an eye out for the next episode of Corporticians and Revolving Doors of Power. This will continue with the Supreme Court, covering the Melville Fuller Court into our modern Supreme Court. If you would like to get your own copy of Corporticians and Revolving Doors of Power, please visit Amazon Books, Barnes & Noble's online bookstore, or visit clevelandkelly.com. That's KELLY.com. Thanks for your time.